Bill, the Gospel of Mark is often considered the more, quote, primitive or bare-boned of all the four Gospels. When did you begin to realize that this is farthest from the truth and that it contains an array of esoteric information?
Well, I spent quite a lot of my time teaching the New Testament in schools, and of course I was familiar with them from my seminary days too. But they'd always seemed strange documents to me, and the notion that Mark presented a sort of skeletal account of the life and ministry of Jesus seemed strange as well, because you don't need to read too far before you realize you're in weird territory. You're alerted to its curiousness really early in it. Now, I had read those commentators and Christian apologists who said that, the ancients didn't write history as we write history. It's a different kind of history. And so it troubled me. There were things within the text which made me curious. And one particular bit was where Jesus sends the disciples into the city and says, go into the city where you'll see a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him and he will show you the room where we are to celebrate our Passover. Now, because I had studied astrology from 1966, I had been a student of astrology, and I knew the man carrying the jar of water was a symbol of Aquarius, but I couldn't quite see why it would be here. You know, it's one of those strange things. They talk about things being hidden in plain sight. I really couldn't see the connection between that bit and the rest of the signs of the zodiac and how it might apply to the gospel until one day, for some strange reason, I felt moved to look through the text of Mark and see if I could see the other signs of the zodiac there. I mean, it was a strange, a strange feeling. Why I was prompted to do this. But then when I flicked, I thought, oh my goodness me, they're all here. It's not just the man carrying the jar of water, the symbol of Aquarius. Every one of them is here in one way or another in absolutely perfect order. So I started to flick. I was flicking backwards through the text from Aquarius, because the man carrying the jar of water appears in the same part of the gospel where Jesus talks about the terrible calamities that are coming in the future age. And then if you work back, you have Jesus encountering all the mentors of so-called of Judaism, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and so on, in what later I call the Capricorn section, because Capricorn is about authority, and Jesus challenges the authority of the different schools within the Jewish faith. And then moving backwards again, you come to Sagittarius, and before that you have Scorpio, and then before that comes Libra, where Jesus talks about marriage, which is a very Libran theme, and then Virgo. It all fitted beautifully into place, and I'd never seen it before. It was, it was so curious, because once I'd seen it, it was obvious, but before I'd seen it, it was puzzling. So this occurred in 1989, and then I began to look in detail at the text and to study it really closely, and then I was absolutely convinced that the Gospel of Mark was not a basically historical text, but had a very different purpose in its origins.
And Bill, the question would be obviously the purpose. Like your book shows the narrative of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark going through the houses of the zodiac. What exactly was the purpose of this? Was this something that was for the initiates? Was this a Hellenistic literary style? I mean, why did Mark do this, or the author of Mark?
That's a very good question. The zodiac seems to me, and I'm sure obviously would seem to the ancient world, a beautiful image of journey, because it's the journey of the sun in the sky. It's nothing more than that, you know. It's the sun's annual journey around the heavens. And if you want a metaphor for the life journey of the individual, the zodiac provides it. And so I feel in myself that whoever wrote it was really trying to use this metaphor of the sun in the sky as a metaphor for the spiritual journey of the human being. Starting in the springtime in Aries is a metaphor for the life journey of the human being. And I think that it was that principally which lay at the heart of the work. And it probably originated within a school rather than with an individual. I mean, we talk about Mark being the author, but it could well be that it's an esoteric school which brought this into existence, using Jesus, the figure of Jesus, as a kind of literary device, as an everyman figure, every man and every woman. And each month they would read sections from this text and show how it related to the spiritual journey of the human being.
So he was kind of the Son of God, S-U-N of God, traveling the heavens as well.
Well, I think so. I mean, we do have that homophone in English, which is not necessarily one that would appear in other languages. But yes, I think that is it, fundamentally, that the Son of God is the Son of God, and we are sons and daughters of God, which I think the text makes absolutely clear, and that the journey is the journey of transformation, fundamentally. That, in my own view, the text of Mark is a textbook of spiritual transformation. It gives lessons along the way of how we must live our life in this rather splendid and narrative form. So I think that the early community which brought this into being was an esoteric community. Whether it was Gnostic in any sense that we understand that term is another matter, but it was an esoteric community. And they used this metaphor because it was, let's face it, in the ancient world, astrology was the lingua franca. Everybody would know something about it. Of course, when you don't have any street lights, you can see the sky at night, and it's just utterly spectacular in a way that anyone living in cities never experiences. And to the ancient world, people living under unpolluted skies, without television to distract them, and neon signs and street lamps, the sky was a wonderful spectacle, and they would know their way around it too. We've lost that sense. We don't have any sense of the magnificence of the night sky. Most people you speak to wouldn't have a clue what phase of the moon it was at any particular time. They wouldn't even be able to find Orion in the sky. Whereas in the ancient world, this would have been absolutely common knowledge. So we're talking about people who had a different approach to things, and so it should come as no surprise to us that this kind of metaphor that the author of the Gospel uses would have been used. And of course, even a cursory reading of the Old Testament will make you realize that there's a great deal of astrology there. Divination is always condemned, except of course for the use of sanctioned ones like the Urim and the Thummim. But the zodiac itself was never condemned. The Jewish prophets never once assailed the zodiac or speak one word against it, even when burdened with messages of the wrath and punishment of God upon heathenism and idolatry. So the zodiac itself is not, or was not, considered to be something that was anathema. And you get in the book of Enoch, one of the apocryphal books, you get this little passage which says, "When I beheld them, the 12 constellations, I blessed. Every time in which they appeared, I blessed the Lord of glory, who had made those great and splendid signs, that they might display the magnificence of his works to angels and to the souls of men, and that these might glorify all his works and operations, might see the effect of his power, might glorify the great labor of his hands, and bless him forever." And the number of times 12 appears within the Old Testament, or 7, which is the number of the heavenly bodies that moved, sun, moon, and the 5 planets visible to the naked eye. That these seem to imply a kind of understanding of the cosmos and a poetic view of the cosmos that we have lost. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus tells us that certain parts of the temple in Jerusalem were decorated with celestial and zodiacal imagery. The veil separating the inner and outer courts was decorated with symbols of the zodiac signs, and the 7 lamps before the altar of incense signified the 7 planets, and the 12 loaves that were upon the table signified the circle of the zodiac and the year. So writes Josephus, and I think that that in itself would indicate that the zodiac played some part in the rituals of the ancient Jews. And of course they found zodiacs in the floor of synagogues. Now these are probably later than the time of Jesus, but even so, it would seem to indicate that it did have some part to play. And you find them in Chartres, of course, and in the great cathedrals. Zodiacs are present. And one wonders why that should be if there is not some connection between the Judeo-Christian tradition and astrology.
Yeah, and of course we can't forget that the tale of Samson is probably borrowed from Hercules, and he obviously was a sun god, also going through the zodiacs, doing certain tests.
The early part of the Gospel of Mark reflects the sign Aries, the springtime sign. You have this sense of moving out from the past, which is, of course, what you would expect in the new year. A new year begins at the spring equinox. Everything changes. Things begin to grow. The past is over. Newness abounds. And so the miracle stories within the gospel at that point all reflect that. For example, Jesus says to the man, "Your sins are forgiven." In a sense, forget your sins and move outwards, move onwards. The man with the withered hand, and then there's the cure of the leper. All these are occurring in this first section. Leprosy was considered to be living death. In the Middle Ages, people would actually read the funeral service over the leper, even though he was not yet physically dead. But in one sense, he was dead. All of us, in one sense, are spiritually dead, like this leper is dead. And Jesus, the figure of Jesus, calls him and calls us into life again. It's a rebirth moment from death to life, which you find again in the springtime. But also in Aries, strangely, you have the story of the apostles following Jesus. James and John follow Jesus, leaving their father and the hired men in the boat. Now, the hired man was the name of the constellation Aries in ancient Babylon. It was called Luhongu and meant the hired man because at this time of the year, when there was a lot of farm work to do, when springtime was beginning, the farmers had to hire extra hands to work their land. And so Aries, that time of the year, became called the hired man. And you have this little reference to it in those early chapters of Mark. beautiful. I mean, these are all very skillfully woven in.
Could you maybe give us some more examples of maybe some of the more obscure passages that are crystallized by their zodiacal position? I mean, why did Jesus curse that poor little fig tree? I mean, why did he have a problem with that thing? I mean, it wasn't fair.
And it's a good question, too, and it's another one of those things that perplexes people who read the Gospels, because we have this notion of Jesus, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, which comes to us from pious Sunday school teaching, but is certainly not found in the Gospels. Man comes to Jesus who is deaf, and Jesus puts his fingers in his ears and he cures the man. And he uses the word ephatha, be open. And the man's ears are opened and he can hear for the first time. But it's that word ephatha which appears in this section of the Gospel, which is really the answer to all these bigotries. And that is, open up, break down the shell, cut through the carapace of your culture, which is keeping everything foreign away from you. And further in the same section, a man comes to Jesus who is blind, and Jesus cures the man. He makes a little bit of mud from spittle and he rubs it on the man's eyes, and he says, "Can you see?" And the man says, "Oh, I can see men, but they look like walking trees." So Jesus repeats the cure, and then the man can see clearly. And here again, this is an absolutely beautiful image of what we need to do in our spiritual life. What we see when we look out at human beings are walking trees. So we are not yet able to perceive that person that I'm looking at is a child of God exactly as I am. We are still at the stage of discerning them as being slightly less human than we as individuals are. And so, if you like, the lesson of this whole section is the breaking down of the barriers between individuals and between nations and cultures and religions, so that we learn to see each other as fully formed children of God, human persons. The lesson of the Cancerian episode is precisely that, breaking down the shell. So that's in the Cancerian section. When you go further down to the one that you were mentioning, Miguel, about Sagittarius, about the cursing of the fig tree, the text actually says to us that it wasn't the season for figs, and so Jesus knew perfectly well that he should not have expected any figs on that tree. But what is so curious is that around the constellation Sagittarius is a constellation which the ancient world called Ara. That's the Latin. But the Greek word Ara means curse. And in that section of the Gospel, the word for curse which he uses incorporates this word Ara in it. And so here is a constellation mentioned which is not zodiacal. Again, of course, they're not overtly mentioned. They're not absolutely clear. But they're there for the discerning eye to pick up. And so the cursing of the fig tree occurs in the Sagittarius section of the Gospel. And so it has to be understood in connection with the whole business of what Sagittarius stands for. And Sagittarius stands for the conquest of the bestial by the divine within the human being. Sagittarius, according to Ptolemy, is a bicorporeal sign, double-bodied, as is Gemini. And the symbol of it is the centaur, half man, half horse. And Jesus comes into Jerusalem on a horse. Now, this is curious, because whenever we imagine this incident, it is always Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. But that comes from Matthew's Gospel. It does not come from Mark. Mark uses the word polos in Greek, meaning a horse, and a young horse. Now, if you imagine this for a minute, it's very different from the scene as pictured by Matthew. Jesus sends his apostles into the city to bring back a horse. And they find it, strangely, at the place where two roads meet. Another tiny little detail. The place where two roads meet. The place where two roads meet is the human being, the two roads, the celestial and the bestial. They bring this horse to Jesus, and Jesus gets on it. Now, it's a horse, the text tells us, on which no one has ever sat. Now, a horse on which no one has ever sat is an unbroken horse. Jesus is not riding a sedate donkey into Jerusalem. He's riding an unbroken horse into Jerusalem, indicating that here he has mastery over the bestial. And here, symbolically, is what all of us should be aiming to achieve. That is another aspect of the spiritual journey, the conquest of the bestial by the divine within the human person. And then you have the story of the fig tree, which again demonstrates the authority of the divine over the natural, which is what this whole section of the Gospel of Mark is trying to teach us.
The culmination of the Gospel, or any Gospel, is the Passion of Christ, which falls under Pisces. What are some of the lessons or insights you glean from them?
That's a good question, Miguel. It does come under Pisces, and one of the interesting things about my research into this was to find that one of the ancient 2nd century Gnostics, Valentinus, had actually said that the career of Jesus lasted 1 year, and it began in the springtime and ended in the following spring. And this was attacked by Irenaeus, the first real defender of what became orthodoxy at the end of the 2nd century. And he had no truck with the notion of the career of Jesus lasting 1 year. He wanted it to last numerous years. And the reason was because he, I'm sure, felt that Valentinus was intimating a zodiacal structure to the career of Jesus. The career of Jesus ends in March. Now, of course, the resurrection, crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is always associated with the Jewish Passover, and the Passover occurs at this time. It is based around the twin cycles of the sun and moon. So Passover occurs as Easter occurs on the Easter Sunday is the first Sunday following the first full moon after the spring equinox. So it's definitely based around celestial cycles, and it occurs in Pisces. And you know, the story of the crucifixion and death of Jesus is an incredibly Piscean story in so many ways. Pisces associated with dreams and with betrayal. Pisces wasn't a sign that was really liked in the ancient world, but this is the culmination of the whole of the gospel and of the whole, if you like, of the spiritual journey, and it ends in death. Now, death, the Gospel of Mark ends with the empty tomb, with the discovery of the fact that Jesus is raised from the dead, and Jesus' message is, go and tell Peter that I'll meet him and the rest in Galilee. Now, that's where it all began. So the whole thing begins again. You know, they're going to meet in Galilee. Galil, by the way, in Hebrew means circle. And Jesus is from Galilee. The whole thing begins in Galilee, and then it's going back to Galilee right at the end. So the circle begins once more. Now, either indicating, if you like, reincarnation, or indicating that once we have got through one cycle of our preparation, the whole thing ties up in that way, moving through the 12 stages into transformation. and resurrection, which is what transformation means. And another beautiful little things again, we're all crucified by two thieves, you know. It's interesting that the Gospel of Mark, which is very sparing in detail, it says that Jesus was crucified between two thieves, one on his right and one on his left. And, you know, there's a lot of room here for imaginative speculation, but my own speculation is that here is the crucifixion of the human being between the two thieves which steal our life. So every detail, every single detail counts. People think of Mark as a kind of ragbag into which things have been thrown indiscriminately and haphazardly. But in fact, it is meticulously constructed. The ordering is crucial and actually gives us some way to understand what the author's message is. So the person who constructed the Gospel of Mark was brilliant. Not simply somebody one wet Sunday afternoon deciding to put together a few little bits of detail that had come his way about Jesus, but these things are put in order for a real purpose. And we can really, in a sense, only understand the individual stories when we realize which section they are placed in.